You've got the entire weekend ahead of you. 2 full days, nothing scheduled, no one expecting anything from you. And by Sunday night, you haven't done a single thing you actually wanted to do. Not because you chose to rest, not because you decided to take it easy. You just couldn't start. You sat there with every option available and felt this thick, heavy nothing. You scrolled, you snacked, you half-watched something you didn't care about. And underneath all of it was this quiet, constant hum of guilt. Because you know you're not stupid. You know you're capable. You just couldn't get your body to move toward anything that mattered. That feeling isn't laziness. It's not a character flaw or a lack of discipline. What you just experienced has a specific neurological signature, and once you understand the mechanism behind it, every frustrating pattern you've had with productivity, focus, and motivation is going to make a different kind of sense. This video is going to show you exactly what's happening inside your brain when this hits, why everything you've tried to fix it has probably made it worse, and what the actual exit looks like. If this channel's ever made you feel like you finally understand something about yourself that no one else explained clearly, subscribing is how you make sure the next one finds you. That's all it is. A way to keep the signal in your feed. Here's what you've probably been told. You've been told that laziness is an effort problem. That if you're not doing things, it's because you're not trying hard enough, or you don't want it badly enough, or you lack some internal fire that productive people have. So the advice you get is always about adding more structure, more accountability, more willpower. Wake up earlier, make a list, set a timer, just do it. And sometimes you do try those things. You install the app, you write the plan, and for a day, maybe 2, something shifts. Then it collapses again, and now you don't just feel lazy. You feel like a failure because even the fix didn't work. The framing is structurally wrong. It treats your inability to act as a deficit of energy, when what you're actually experiencing is an excess of stimulation. You're not running on empty. You're running so full that your brain can't distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. Everything has the same emotional weight, which means nothing gets prioritized, which means nothing gets started. The engine isn't broken. It's flooded. To understand what's actually happening, think about the last time you walked into a room where someone was playing music, the TV was on, 2 people were having a conversation, and a phone was buzzing on the counter. You didn't process all of those inputs clearly. Your brain did something very specific. It flattened them. It turned all of it into background noise. You stopped being able to pick out the lyrics, follow the conversation, or notice the buzzing. Not because any of those inputs were too complex on their own, but because the total volume of stimulation crossed a threshold where your brain's only defense was to stop giving any of it priority. Everything became equally ignorable. That's what's happening to your dopamine system. Not in a room for a few minutes, but across your entire waking life. Dopamine doesn't do what most people think it does. It's not the chemical that makes you feel pleasure. It's the chemical that marks things as worth pursuing. It's a prediction signal. When your brain encounters something that might lead to a reward, dopamine spikes just enough to say, "This one. Move toward this." That signal is what you experience as motivation. Not the reward itself, but the pull toward it. It's what makes you get off the couch. It's what makes you open the document instead of the app. It's the neurological equivalent of a spotlight in a dark room. illuminating the one thing you should move toward next. Now here's the problem. That spotlight only works when most of the room is dark. Dopamine operates on contrast. A notification feels compelling when you're sitting in silence. A video feels interesting when you haven't watched one in hours. A new message feels urgent when your phone's been still. But when your entire environment is engineered to deliver small dopamine hits constantly, your brain starts doing the same thing it did in that noisy room. It flattens everything. It stops marking anything as more important than anything else because the signal-to-noise ratio has collapsed. You aren't undermotivated. You're so overstimulated that your brain literally cannot generate the contrast it needs to point you at one thing and say go. This is called dopamine habituation, and it's not a theory. Researchers at Vanderbilt University mapped dopamine function in people who self-identified as go-getters versus those who described themselves as lazy. What they found wasn't a difference in total dopamine. Both groups had plenty. The difference was in where dopamine was most active. In the so-called lazy group, dopamine was disproportionately active in the anterior insula, a region associated with risk perception and emotional processing. Their brains weren't failing to produce motivation. Their brains were producing so much noise around every potential action that the motivational signal couldn't cut through. The spotlight was on, but so was every other light in the room. Nothing stood out. So nothing got chosen. Seneca saw this 20 centuries before anyone could scan a brain. He wrote that to be everywhere is to be nowhere. He was describing the Roman aristocrat surrounded by entertainment, banquets, and spectacle who somehow felt less alive than the farmer working a single field. The farmer's world was narrow, and because it was narrow, everything in it had weight. The aristocrat's world was wide and saturated, so nothing in it registered as real. Seneca didn't have the word dopamine, but he was diagnosing the exact same flattening. Too many inputs, no contrast, no capacity to choose. Not because the person was weak, but because the environment made clarity impossible. This is the part where it gets personal, because this mechanism isn't theoretical. It's running in the background of your life right now, and it expresses itself in patterns you've probably noticed but haven't connected. Think about how you start your morning. Before your feet hit the floor, you've reached for your phone. Not because you're expecting something important. It's reflexive. And within 90 seconds, you've consumed a dozen micro-stimuli, a headline, a notification, a message preview, a reel that auto-played. None of it meaningful, all of it just enough to trigger a tiny dopamine response. By the time you're standing in the kitchen, your brain has already processed more novelty than your great-grandparents encountered in a full day. And you haven't done anything yet. You haven't made a single choice that matters. But your dopamine system has already been tapped dozens of times. So when you sit down to do something real, something that requires sustained attention before the reward arrives, your brain compares that slow, delayed signal to the rapid-fire ones it's already been getting, and the real task loses. Not because it isn't important, because your brain can't feel that it's important. The contrast has been destroyed before the day even started. The first trap is the one you're probably most familiar with. You try to force yourself through it. You sit down, you white-knuckle the task, you use deadlines and pressure and guilt as fuel. And sometimes it works for a while. But forcing focus through a flooded dopamine system is like trying to hear a whisper at a concert by listening harder. The problem isn't your ears. The problem is the volume of everything else. Willpower in this state doesn't build discipline. It builds resentment. You start associating meaningful work with suffering, and the next time you think about starting, your brain flinches before you even sit down. That flinch isn't laziness. It's a conditioned aversion you built by forcing yourself through a system that was never going to respond to force. The second trap is subtler, and it's the one most people don't realize they've fallen into. You cope by switching to a softer form of stimulation and calling it rest. You put on a show. You browse something less intense. You tell yourself you're recharging. But your dopamine system doesn't distinguish between intense stimulation and mild stimulation the way you think it does. It only cares about frequency. A gentle scroll through a feed is still dozens of novel inputs per minute. A background show is still a stream of unpredictable scene changes, dialogue cues, and emotional beats. You feel like you're resting. Your brain is still sprinting. And the flatness you feel afterward, that heavy, blank tiredness that doesn't feel like real rest, that's not because you need more sleep. It's because you never actually stopped. The path between those two traps is narrower than you think, but it's real. It's not about doing more. It's not about resting more. It's about creating gaps where your brain can experience low stimulation long enough for the contrast to come back. Because here's what nobody tells you. Your dopamine system recalibrates. It's not permanently broken. It's adaptive. It adjusts to whatever environment you give it. If you give it constant noise, it flattens. If you give it genuine quiet, it sharpens. The spotlight doesn't need to be repaired. It needs the other lights to go off. And that's where the move is. Tonight or tomorrow morning, you're going to do something that sounds almost too simple to work. You're going to give yourself 90 minutes of nothing. Not meditation, not journaling, not a walk with a podcast. Nothing. No screen, no audio, no input. You can sit, you can walk, you can stare out a window. You can lie on your back and look at the ceiling, but no information goes in. For 90 minutes, you let your brain run out of things to react to. Here's what's going to happen. The first 20 minutes will be uncomfortable. Not painful, just restless. Your hands will want your phone. Your mind will throw up random urges. Open something, check something, do something. That restlessness isn't a sign it's not working. That is it working. That's your brain searching for the stimulation it's habituated to and not finding it. Around minute 30 or 40, something subtle shifts. The urgency fades, your thoughts slow down. Not because you forced them to, but because without new input to process, your brain starts settling into a different mode. This is your default mode network coming online, the system responsible for long-range thinking, self-reflection, and creative connection. It's the system that gets suppressed every time you reach for your phone. By minute 60, you'll start noticing something that feels almost foreign. A thought will surface, maybe about a project, a conversation, something you've been meaning to do, and it'll carry weight. It'll feel like it matters. That's contrast returning. You don't need to do this every day. You need to do it enough that your brain remembers what low stimulation feels like. 3 times in the next week, 90 minutes each. No bargaining on the terms. No substituting a quiet podcast. No calling a long shower close enough. Nothing means nothing. You're not punishing yourself. You're giving your nervous system the one thing it's been starving for in an environment that never stops feeding it. The reason this works at a neurological level is precise. Dopamine receptor sensitivity is regulated by exposure. When you flood the system with frequent, low-effort reward signals, receptor density actually decreases. Your neurons pull receptors off the surface because the current level of stimulation is too high for stable functioning. Fewer receptors means each signal registers less. That's the flatness you feel. When you remove the flood, even temporarily, receptor density starts to normalize. Signals that were invisible an hour ago begin to register again. The task you couldn't start feels startable, not because you became more disciplined, because your brain can finally feel the signal that was there all along. You're not lazy. You never were. You've been living inside an environment that was engineered, literally designed by teams of people whose job it is to keep your dopamine system activated, to make sure you never experience enough silence for the contrast to return. And when that constant activation made it impossible for you to choose the things that mattered to you, you looked inward and blamed yourself. You called it a discipline problem. You called it procrastination. You called yourself lazy. But the problem was never you. The problem was that you never had the information to see what was actually happening. So the question isn't whether you can become more productive. It isn't whether you can beat the laziness. There is no laziness to beat. The question is whether you're willing to be bored. Whether you're willing to sit in a quiet room with nothing happening and let your brain remember what it feels like to want something on its own, not because an algorithm pointed you at it, but because something inside you reached for it. That's not willpower. That's not discipline. That's what your brain does naturally when you stop drowning it. You don't need to become a different person. You just need to give the person you already are a fighting chance at silence. The loudest rooms produce the flattest minds. And the way back to clarity was never about adding something. It was about having the nerve to take almost everything away and trust that what remains is enough. It is. It always was.